Welcome back to ZenMadman's Hand of the Day. In this installment, we've got a nice little bluffy spot here. And we're going to talk about bet sizing, we're going to look at the solver a little bit, but first let's just look at the action, right? My opponent raises to 3x from the lojack. So I think they're going to have a fairly strong range, right? The 3x sizing should go along with a slightly stronger range than a smaller sizing, but not super big deal, right? They'll probably still have somewhere between 15 and 18%, I'd say, of a range. It folds to me on the button. I have Jack 10 suited. I can flat this hand. I can 3-bet this hand. With a looser player in the big blind, I might be inclined to flat it a little bit more often, but in general, I'm going to be mixing. What I like to do for mixing, if I want to go about 50-50, is if I have the larger card on the left, then I'm going to 3-bet. If I have the larger card on the right, then I'm going to take the passive action. So here I go ahead and 3-bet. I 3x their 3x, so 9x. It folds around to them, and they call, and we get a flop. And this flop is very dry, right? 994, rainbow. If we just talk about, first let's look at the SPR, right? We should always start with that. It's about 5-to-1, meaning there's about 5 times as much money in my stack, which is the effective stack. It doesn't matter that they have extra money, as there is in the middle, right? So that means we're going to generally have kind of like a 3-street strategy here, where if we have value hands, we can go bet, bet, bet. And if we have bluffs, we can go bluff, bluff, bluff. It's not like we're going to cram the money in on 1 or 2 streets, although we could, right? And we'll get back to that in a little bit. Now we want to look at ranges, right? My opponent's range, I think, is going to have a lot of middle pairs. They're going to have a lot of hands like 5s, 6s, 7s, 8s that are going to raise pre-flop and then call a 3-bet. Maybe they fold some 5s or 6s to my 3-bet, not sure. Maybe sometimes they have 2s, 3s, or 4s. But usually those hands are going to be folded from the lojack, especially for a 3x open. And then they can have things like 9s, not a lot of pocket 9s left. They can have 10s, jacks, maybe queens, right? Those hands are possible. Then they're also going to have some like suited connectors, some suited aces, maybe some ace queen offsuit type stuff, maybe occasionally like an ace king offsuit that decides to just flat out of position. And I think that's going to be most of their range, maybe like a king jack suited sort of thing. Knowing that, right, their range has a lot of these sort of medium value hands, but not really strong hands, like a lot of bluff catchers and then a lot of air. My range, on the other hand, is going to have a lot of big pairs, right? I've got aces, kings, queens, full frequency, a lot of jacks, 10s, some 9s, maybe some 8s. The smaller pocket pairs are generally going to flat in this spot, and 9s and maybe 10s, sometimes I'm flatting. Maybe even occasionally jacks, but I've got this thick value, you know, up at the top. Those overpairs are very strong here because hands like 9-10 suited, 8-9 suited, there's just not a lot of combos of those, right? So my opponent can have those, I can have those. That real nutty range, you know, 4-4, neither of us are going to have much. 9-9, that's one combo. The super nutty range isn't going to exist a lot, right? So aces, kings, queens, those are going to be nutty hands in my estimation on this flop, basically. So I'm going to have a nuttiness advantage. I'm going to have that second tier value advantage as well. Maybe sort of second and a half tiers, those middle pairs, they're going to have an advantage. And then I'm going to have a lot of ace king, maybe some ace queen, some other suited aces and suited connectors that are all basically like whiffs. Although a hand like ace king is ahead of everything but a pair, right? So anyway, I'm going to want to bet range, I think, on this flop. My first thought was like, I've got a lot of nuttiness. I've got those big pairs that can play very strong, and going for like third pot or quarter pot doesn't put their medium pairs in too tough a situation. But if I go for half pot or maybe even pot, I think I can put a lot of pressure when I have my big hands, and then I can use hands like ace king and stuff like that as well to mix in there. So anyway, I decide to go ahead with a half pot bet. Not super sure at the time of play that this was the best sizing, but it felt right because I was thinking I've got all these very strong hands in my range and they don't have so many. I also think in general, you know, this combo is very good for betting, right? I mean, I'm betting my range, I think, but Jack 10 of hearts blocks 10-9 of hearts. It blocks Jack 9 of hearts if they have that in their range, suited Jack 9. You know, I've also got a double backdoor. I've got a backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw. And I would say Jack 10 of hearts is better than like Jack 10 of clubs, even though Jack 10 of clubs has 3 cards to a straight flush immediately, right? Hitting a straight flush probably isn't going to be super important in this hand. Being able to block the suited combos of 10-9 is much more important than blocking the offsuit combos. So far, this player hasn't done anything super out of line, so I don't feel like I need to really worry about them having like 10-9 offsuit type stuff in their range. Some players might have it, but that's not going to be the standard. Anyway, they do call, and the turn's an offsuit 5, completing the rainbow, right? So they check to me, and I feel like this is a pretty clear bluff. You know, I've started telling a story on the flop. I could still have aces, kings, queens in my range. The 5 doesn't change much. Maybe they have pocket 5s and they binked a boat, but maybe they don't, right? And that's not going to be a huge part of their range anyway. There's still going to be tons of their range that I want to get value from with my big pairs, and so I still get to have a good amount of bluffs in my range. Again, having the Jack 10 suited that is not suited to either of the 9s helps protect me against running into into trips too often. So I do go ahead and bet. I was thinking I probably, like, I don't want to go pot size because then on the river, I don't really have too much of a credible barrel. If I go half pot, bet about $9 here, get called for 9. Then there's going to be 36 in the middle with like 38 back. So I decided to go for 3/4, right? So my 3/4 pot bet, I think makes sense. We'll take a look at the solver in a bit, but it, I think, gives them a spot where they've got to be like, do I want to put my chips in or not, right? And they kind of have to commit at this point, and I can follow up with a river barrel, but I don't necessarily have to. And we don't end up seeing what the river is because I bet this and then they jam and I fold. So it didn't work out. That doesn't mean it's a bad play. We're going to look at sort of what the equilibrium would be in this spot. I'm comfortable with my logic here. Let me know if you think otherwise. I do feel like it's at least, I think, exploitatively and balanced. I think it's a play that makes sense. Maybe I could have gone a little smaller on the turn bet. I don't have to risk as much here, and then I can always pile it in on the river with my value hands and with the bluffs that I want to make. So maybe my turn bet's a little big, but we'll check it out. In terms of my opponent's range, like, I didn't think really too long because I had Jack high. I guess they could have 6-7 suited, and that's possible, right? Like 9-9, I feel like probably wants to check call again and let me make a boat or bet. Maybe if they have like a 9, they decide they want to get it in now against like a big pair, because if, say, I have kings or queens and an ace rolls off, maybe they're afraid of something like that. I don't think they should have a lot of check raises in this spot, but a hand like 4-4, 5-5, 9x, I think certainly can check raise. And regardless, I don't think my Jack 10 is beating very much. So anyway, that's the hand. Let's take a look at the solver. What I've done is run 2 solves. So the first one is going to use a certain set of ranges, and the second one is going to make a little bit of an adjustment to the ranges and see how that affects our optimal strategy. So again, whenever we're using solvers, the idea is to look at what the equilibrium would be against an opponent who's playing well, right? And by playing the equilibrium strategy, then whenever our opponent deviates from the equilibrium strategy for the other side of the equation, we gain, right? That doesn't mean we should always play equilibrium, but I think it's a useful thing to understand where that lies, right? And then we can design our exploits based off of how we think our opponents are deviating from that. If they're folding too much, maybe we overbluff. If they're not folding enough, maybe we underbluff, or we value bet more aggressively, right? So first I want to look at the ranges that I put in. This is the range I gave myself here. It should show up. Basically aces, kings, queens, mostly jacks, or about half the time jacks, sometimes 10s, sometimes 9s, ace king suited all the time, ace king off half the time. I guess that has me flatting it half the time. Or no, ace king off all the time. So always ace king, always queens plus, right? And then ace queen off sometimes, ace queen suited. You know, you see these suited connectors, a little bit of ace 4 and ace 5 suited, more ace 5 than ace 4, a little bit of ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, more ace queen than ace jack and 10 suited, right? So I think this is a reasonable range that represents basically what I'm actually doing in game. And then here's my opponent's range that I put in, right? So I gave them all of ace queen, ace 10 suited through ace queen suited, and like 7s through 10s, saying basically they're never going to 4-bet any of these hands, they're never going to fold them. Maybe they fold ace queen off sometimes, I'm not totally certain, right? So I'm going to come back to ranges and kind of refine them in terms of what I think people are doing, and also what's optimal. but we'll go with this for a while. I've got 5s and 6s at like half frequency, meaning I think they open them, but I think maybe they sometimes fold them to a 3-bet. This is assuming that they fold deuces through 4s. They were the lojacks, so theoretically they probably should be folding them, but some players play them, so we'll come back to that later. And all these suited connectors are at some frequency, basically saying, yeah, they might not always raise them. They might not always call them against a 3-bet. Sometimes they'll fold them. Sometimes maybe they'll 4-bet them. And then just a little bit of queens, some jacks. Maybe I should have given them all jacks. I don't know. Maybe people don't 4-bet that. But I think this is a reasonable range, right? A little bit of ace-king, thinking maybe they'll flat that a little bit out of position. Maybe people don't much, and they basically are just, like ace-king suited, I gave them almost none of, thinking they're basically going to 4-bet that almost all the time. But, so these ranges aren't perfect, right? But it's an idea, and I wanted to show them just so you get an idea of it. All right, and then I gave a number of bet sizes. Because the stack to pot ratio is so small, I'm actually able to give the solver a lot of betting options with the computing power I have, which is not a ton, but it's sufficient to do something, you know, fairly complicated, right? But if the ranges were super wide and or the stack to pot ratio was really high, I'd have to give the solver fewer betting options because the tree would just get super big. Anyway, we'll take a look at the results now. I made the out of position player check, as I believe they're basically always going to do, and I think Equilibrium is going to have them check about all the time anyway. Maybe they'll donk like 1% of the time or something. So, let's look at first in position equity, right? So my equity, according to this, is 58%. And out of position then is going to be 41.5, 58.5, right? But then look at the EV difference. Here it shows their EV as 162 of a 921 pot. These are in pennies. And then mine is 760, right? So I have this huge EV advantage. And that's, I think, because of the way the ranges are structured. Even though I have a strong equity advantage, but the EV advantage is like disproportional to that, right? It's way, way out of whack. So we'll take a look at what my strategy should be. And I gave the solver a bunch of options. I said, you know, you can check. It doesn't want to check. It says 0.27% of the time we'll check. Okay. Bet a quarter pot? Nah, not much, right? 4% of the time. Bet third pot? Again, just 5% of the time. Then I'm like, how about bet half pot? And it's like, yeah, let's do that 60% of the time. And full pot actually wants to bet 30% of the time. So I can use these really big sizings. And so I think my intuition at the table was accurate here, where I was thinking, I've got, you know, my opponent doesn't have a lot of like real nutty hands. And so what would normally constitute nutty hands, like trips or a boat, there's just not that much of. There's no two pair combos are any one pair, right? I have aces and there's 9s on board. So those are going to be really nutty combos. Like if we look at aces here, it actually wants to bet full pot a substantial amount of the time, like 38% of the time, 30-something% of the time, and bet half pot basically the rest of the time. And the reason for that is that my opponent just has so few hands that beat aces that aces become like the effective nuts, right? And they don't have aces. They don't have kings. Maybe they have a little bit of queens, but I didn't give them much of that. And I don't think they're going to have a lot of that. So those hands are going to be played like the nuts, right? Even jacks are going to be played like the nuts because there's just not a lot of hands that beat them. 10s are going to be played very strong. 9s are going to be played strong as well, right? All these overpairs. Oh, 9s are quads. And it actually just wants me to bet them all the time. So reminder to bet your quads, kids. Anyway, that might sound like I'm encouraging underage gambling. But you can bet without gambling. That's a thing. Yeah, bet your quads. Okay, so this basically says bet half pot, or if you want, you can go bigger because your opponent doesn't have much like 4-4 or 9x or anything like that. So if we click that half pot bet, we look at my opponent's strategy. They're supposed to fold almost 72% of their range. That's ridiculous, right? I bet half pot, minimum defense frequency would be like 33%, right? Because, yeah, I think so. So they're calling... Wait, would it be 33% or would it be 67%? It would be a lot more than this. Yeah. I think 67%. I'm sorry. I got it backwards. And that's how out of whack it is. They're supposed to call, in order to keep me from having a profitable C-bet, like 67% of the time. Pretty sure that's right. But they can only call you know, they can only continue like 28, 29% of the time because my range has this huge advantage. And that's why I get to bet range, right? Because they can't defend against it. And so when you're in this situation where there's this huge range advantage where there's they're not symmetrical, range asymmetry, I guess we call it, right? When you're in a situation like that, you can't go like, oh, well, the minimum defense frequency is 67%, so I'm going to have to call with my ace 10. Like, you can't do that because you're just going to get crushed, right? You just have to accept, like, hey, my range isn't prepared on this board to really be able to defend effectively, right? So they get to win a lot. They get to push me off a lot of my equity. Me, in this case, being the person out of position and my opponent, right? So I'm kind of putting myself in their shoes. So they only continue 27% of the time, and they only raise like 1% of the time, right? Because what can they raise? They've got a little bit of quads, they've got a little bit of trips, that's it, right? And everything else is crushed. Like if they have queens, jacks, tens, those are crushed by my aces and kings and queens mostly, right? And they actually fold a lot of tens. Pocket tens are going to do a lot of folding here. So real players might not do this. Real players are probably calling too much, I think. And so that's going to inform our interpretation of the turn data. But let's see what happens when they call, right? Which is what they did. And then the turn was the 5 of spades. And I gave it the option to lead out here, but really they're just checking, basically range. And you'll see, again, here, if we look at the sizings, it really wants to use half pot or full pot. And not much of anything else except for checking, right? It's going to check about 40% of the time because there's only so many value hands now. While my range is the same as it was on the flop because I just bet range, right? I mean, it's a little different because I use different sizings. But say I bet half pot with range, I've got the same hands I had on the flop. But their range has gotten way stronger because they folded 71% of their hands on the flop, right? They folded a ton of hands on the flop. So now their range is way stronger than it had been on the flop. So I don't get to just range bet here again. But aces, kings, queens, these hands can just mash it. They can mash the pot button for value. They can bet half pot also and then jam river, right? If we look at my exact combo, Jack 10 of hearts, we'll see Jack 10 of hearts, Jack 10 of spades. Both of them like to bet about half the time, and their preferred bet sizes are about half pot or full pot, right? So I was in the ballpark in terms of bet sizing, given these assumptions in terms of range, which were my first assumptions in terms of range. We'll look at something else in a moment. And you'll see Jack 10 of spades and Jack 10 of hearts on the lower right hand down there. Really are way, I have to hover over that to keep that up so I can't point it with the mouse, are betting significantly more than Jack 10 of clubs and Jack 10 of diamonds. And the reason for that is because they're blocking a lot of the nutty hands that are going to jam, right? That are going to call and just have them drawing dead. So, you know, if the opponent calls with hands like 8 and you have Jack 10, well, you've got 6 outs, right? So you've got equity. If they call with a hand like 9-8, you don't have equity, right? So you really want to be blocking like those or 9-8, 10-9, right? You want to be blocking those 10-9 of suit cards. We'll look at like Queen Jack and King Queen and Ace Queen, and like, why are these betting so much more? There's a good reason, and we'll show what happens if I bet half pot, right? Which I didn't, but whatever. They're actually folding a lot of 10s, right? So because they're folding a lot of 10s, I don't want to bluff with a 10 as much because now I'm blocking their folding range. So I'm not gaining as much. There's not as many 10s for me to get them to fold, right? Whereas if I have Queen Jack, you'll see all the queens and jacks, almost all the queens and almost all the jacks are continuing. So if I have Queen Jack, I'm blocking those continue hands. My bluff is going to be more profitable because they don't have as many of those hands in their range. Okay, so let's see what happens if I did bet this size and they call, and then the river's like, we'll make it like a deuce off. Well, they're all offsuit, right? And they're supposed to check. And am I supposed to barrel with Jack 10? Sometimes, right? I can jam. I can not jam. I basically only have Jack 10 of hearts and spades at that point. I think we've basically done enough with this sim, but we can also just look like 65% of the time after taking this line, half pot, I'm jamming river, right? Because I've got all those aces, kings, queens, and then I'm using like ace, queen, king, queen, 10, all the 9-acts also, but those are bluffing, right? Jacks are just checking back. They're like, all right, we'll take a showdown. 10s are jamming for some reason. I'm not totally certain what's up with that. It looks like the main 10s I have are 10 of spades, 10 of hearts, and those are just more comfortable, I guess, because they're not going to run into 10-9 suited, right? They're blocking all of the 10-9 suited. But so yeah, it's important, I think, on a board like this to play aces, kings, queens for stacks, right? To understand, like, yeah, if they've got a 9, they've got a 9, but they don't have a lot of 9s, right? And they've got tons of pocket pairs, and we can try and get value from all those pocket pairs, thick value, and we can also use a substantial number of hands, number of combos to bluff, like ace queen, king queen, ace 10 it likes, right? And some of those jack 10 suited hands, particularly the suit that I had. Okay, so here's a second sim, and the main difference is I changed my opponent's range to basically say what happens if they raise all pocket pairs from the low jack and they call a 3-bet with them. Right now, I could have discounted 2s and 3s or whatever, but I basically said, okay, if they're going to have 4s here, they're probably going to have 3s and 2s. And let's take a look at what that does to my flop approach. So we'll just quickly go into the browser. They're going to check range, and we look at my strategy, and all of a sudden, now it's 85% betting half pot, and very rare, like 8-9% betting full pot, right? So before I was betting full pot like 30% of the time. Now I'm betting it less than 10% of the time. So you can still have those full pot bets in there, even if they're going to have a set of 4s, but you want to lean more towards half pot, right? So if we do the half pot and they call, again, here now, look, they're only folding 60%, right? Before they were folding over 70%. So they have more hands to defend with, partially because, you know, they have 4-4. Having those 3 combos of 4-4 gives them more combos that are like excited about the board, but having those also lets them defend more of their range because it kind of gates my aggression, right? It makes it harder for me to continue barreling because I have to know, well, they could have 4s full here, right? Notice again, though, that they basically just call with 4s full. And that makes sense, right? They're just like, yeah, just keep bluffing with all your bluffs and your value hands are drawing to 2 outs, not a big deal. So they call, and the turn's a 5 of spades. And now, again, they're just going to do a ton of checking, right? And if I look at my jack 10, I'm still using, it looks like half pot here with a reasonable frequency, but it's only like a quarter of the time. So I'd say jack 10 is like mostly a check if they're going to have a hand like 4s full, which after the action in the hand, I think there's a reasonable chance they did. It's basically 4s full, 5s full, 9-8 suited, 10-9 suited, maybe ace-9 suited, or like some kind of bluff or something. But mostly I'm betting half pot here, even against this range that has the 4s full in it. Now they're raising their 4-4. Apparently they're not really raising their 5-5 as much. They're kind of just like, all right, come on, keep betting. But they're kind of mixing there, or they are mixing. And say they call on the river again is that deuce of diamonds. Again, they're basically just checking, nothing's changed, and I'm still jamming my aces, kings, most of my queens, and all these bluffs. And if I bet the turn with jack 10 suited, I'm jamming river, right? For the most part. I mean, not 100%, but at a high frequency. So I think what this shows is that a small change in an opponent's range might, if it like really affects their nuttiness, right? How much nuts they have, it can change our betting strategy fairly significantly, particularly in terms of flop sizing in this case. But when it's only a few combos like that, we're still going to be able to take those overpairs and play them really strong and just go like, just step on the gas, just bet, bet, bet. And really with the goal of getting all the money in, where it's like, hey, if you've got those 3 combos, or maybe the couple combos of 9-8 suited or whatever you might have, you know, good for you, right? But most of the time you won't. Most of the time you'll have like 10s, 8s, 7s, 6s, hopefully not 5s on this turn, but there's plenty of hands to get value from. And because we have all those hands that can get value, there is a, we get to have a corresponding, not an equal number of bluffs, but the appropriate number of bluffs based on, you know, math and stuff. Anyway, that's been a little bit of solver action. Let me know how you like, you know, the way I go about using the solver on stream and on stream. This is a video, whatever. You know, like and subscribe, and let me know if there's anything else in particular that you'd really be interested in seeing. And have a great day. Cheers.